Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking closer at something I know you're really interested in. The first enslaved people to arrive in Virginia. We're going to be pulling from the Encyclopedia Virginia article, First Virginia Enslaved People, to kind of try to unravel their origins and their journey and what life was like for them in those early days of the colony.
Yeah, it's a story full of twists and turns, and it challenges a lot of assumptions I think people might have about the very beginnings of slavery in this country.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely seems like one of those moments in history that had ripple effects for generations. So let's kind of set the scene. We're in 1619, and a Portuguese slave ship called the São João Bautista is sailing from Angola. But here's where things get interesting. These Africans weren't originally headed for Virginia.
Right. Their destination was Veracruz in New Spain, what we know as Mexico today. But then English privateers enter the picture, and everything changes.
Okay, privateers, those were basically pirates with the king's blessing, right? Given permission to attack enemy ship.
Exactly. They operated under something called letters of marque, which made their actions legal, at least in the eyes of the English crown. In this case, two English ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer, intercepted the San Juan Bautista off the coast of Mexico. They weren't interested in gold or silver, though. They stole a portion of the ship's human cargo.
It's just chilling to think of people being treated as goods to be traded. So how did those stolen Africans end up in Virginia? Was it just a matter of convenience, or was there something more strategic at play?
Well, the White Lion, commanded by John Colin Jope, made a beeline for Point Comfort, Virginia, arriving in late August 1619. A letter from John Rolfe, the colony's secretary, mentions them trading 20 and odd Negroes for food. Imagine that. Humans exchanged for provisions.
Yeah, it really highlights the purely economic view of people that fueled this whole terrible system. And what about the treasurer? Did it follow the same route?
The treasurer, under the command of Daniel Elfreth, showed up a few days later with roughly 30 more Africans. But they hit a snag. The people at Keycoughton, which is modern-day Hampton, refused to trade with them.
Why would they refuse? You'd think any port would be open to trade, especially back then.
Yeah, it likely wasn't about taking a moral stand against slavery. Elfreth's letter of marque had become invalid because the Duke of Savoy had made peace with Spain. Trading with Elfreth would have put Virginia's officials in hot water, potentially even branding them as pirates themselves.
Ah, so legality, not morality, was the deciding factor. What a world. So where did the Africans on the treasurer end up?
Elfreth sailed to Bermuda and sold the remaining Africans, about 25 of them there. The governor of Bermuda was actually happy about it, even calling them the most proper and cheap instruments for the colony. He claimed he couldn't have produced any tobacco revenue without them. It just shows how quickly the mindset of exploitation took hold.
Yeah, it's just appalling to hear those words. These were real people with lives and stories reduced to mere instruments of profit. It makes you wonder what was going through their minds facing this totally alien world. But we can at least shed some light on where they came from. For a long time, historians thought these first Africans were from the Caribbean, right?
Yes, that was the prevailing theory. But thanks to research by Ingle Slater and John K. Thornton, we now know they were likely captured in the Ndongo region of present-day Angola.
Ndongo. I don't know much about that area. Can you paint a picture of what life was like there?
The Ndongo people were farmers and herders with a blend of urban and rural communities. They had their own complex society and culture, one that was, of course, being disrupted by Portuguese colonization and the slave trade.
So these weren't just individuals plucked randomly from across the continent. They would have shared a language, customs, maybe even some understanding of the world beyond their own. That common ground must have been both a comfort and a source of deep sorrow as they faced this terrifying new reality together.
You're right, that shared background would have been a lifeline, and there's evidence that some Ndongo people had even been exposed to Catholicism through Jesuit missionaries. Plus, Portuguese law required enslaved Africans to be baptized before being shipped to the Americas.
It's strange to think of forced conversion happening even before they set foot on these shores, though I imagine for some it might have been a way to hold on to a piece of their own spiritual traditions, even if twisted and manipulated.
It's certainly complex, and it's hard to know the true impact of these forced conversions. Were they seen as a complete rejection of their own beliefs, or was there a way to blend those beliefs with the new religion?
That's a question for the ages, I suppose. But let's shift gears a bit and look at what happened once they arrived in Virginia. How were they classified, and what kind of life did they face?
The 1620 Virginia census lists 32 Africans living in the colony. They were categorized as others not Christians in the service of the English.
Servants, not slaves. That's interesting. Was that just a matter of semantics, or was their legal status truly different back then?
It's a point worth considering. At that time, English and Virginia law hadn't fully codified race-based chattel slavery, so these Africans occupied a legal gray area. Their lives were undoubtedly ones of forced labor, but the system hadn't yet hardened into the rigid, brutal institution we think of today.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what might have been if things had unfolded differently. But sadly, we know the direction history took. What were the conditions like for these first Africans in Virginia?
Life was undeniably harsh. By 1624, the African population had dwindled to 21, likely due to disease and conflict with Native Americans, particularly during Opefekano's uprising in 1622. Remember, they arrived in August, the peak of summer sickness. Their bodies wouldn't have been prepared for the diseases they encountered.
It's heartbreaking to imagine them facing those challenges on top of everything else. But amidst the hardship, are there any glimpses of individual stories, any signs of hope or resilience pushing through?
Absolutely. The 1624 and 1625 musters reveal some fascinating details. Some Africans were listed with European names suggesting they had been baptized. We even see families forming. Anthony and Isabella had a son named William, the first named child of African descent, born in Virginia.
William. It's such a powerful name, a symbol of new life beginning even in the face of such adversity. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit finds ways to persevere. Are there any other individual stories that stand out to you?
The story of Anthony and Mary Johnson is truly remarkable. They arrived separately in the early 1620s and eventually gained their freedom. They married, had children, acquired land, and built a life for themselves. By the 1650s, they owned 250 acres in Northampton County on the eastern shore.
Wait, they actually owned land. That challenges everything we think we know about this period.
It certainly does. Their sons owned land as well, and the whole family later moved to Maryland, where their grandson even named his farm Angola. It's a testament to their strength and resilience, but it also reveals the complexities of those early decades. While the institution of slavery was solidifying, there was still some degree of fluidity in social and legal status. These weren't monolithic experiences, there were shades of gray, and individual stories like Anthony and Mary's prove that.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the paths not taken, the possibilities that existed before the system became so entrenched. It's a good reminder that history isn't always a straight line. It's full of bends and turns and moments where things could have gone differently.
Exactly. It's about understanding those moments, those choices, and how they shape the world we live in today. Speaking of choices, there's another arrival that's important to discuss, the ship Fortune in 1628.
Okay, what's the story with the fortune?
It actually set sail from Massachusetts Bay but captured a Portuguese slave ship carrying about 100 Angolans. The Fortune's captain then sailed to Virginia and sold these enslaved people for tobacco.
So even though the White Lion and the Treasurer brought the very first Africans this event with the fortune, really ramped up the presence of enslaved people in the colony. Did this mark a turning point? Was this when things really started to shift towards the large-scale entrenched system we know?
It's definitely a pivotal moment. It highlights the growing demand for enslaved labor in the colony, a demand that would sadly only intensify in the years to come.
It's a sobering thought, seeing how those early seeds of exploitation grew into something so vast and destructive.
And the consequences of that early history are still felt today.
Yeah, it's almost like seeing a snowball start to roll downhill, picking up speed and size until it becomes this unstoppable force. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to those early days. I'm thinking about the lives of those first Africans in Virginia. It's easy to lump them all together, but their experiences must have been so varied.
You're actually right. Each individual carried their own story, their own hopes and fears. It's important not to lose sight of that. And we actually have some glimpses into those individual lives. Take the case of a man named Brass.
Brass, what happened to him?
Well, in 1625, the General Court had to step in and settle a dispute over who owned him. He'd been brought to Virginia by a Captain Jones, then sold to a Captain Bass. But there were questions about whether that sale was legal.
It sounds like there were still a lot of legal loopholes being exploited even as the system itself was taking shape. What did the court decide in the end?
Initially, they granted temporary custody of Brass to Lady Temperance Flowerdew Yeardley, the wife of Governor Sir George Yeardley. She had to pay 40 pounds of tobacco a month for his labor. But just a few days later, the court reversed its decision, declared the sale to Captain Bass void, and transferred Brass to the custody of Governor Francis Wyatt.
Wow, it's just back and forth like he's some object being tossed around. You have to wonder what Brass was thinking through all of this, if he had any say at all in his own fate.
Sadly, the records don't give us his perspective, but it does show how these early Africans were often caught in a web of shifting power dynamics and legal battles, their lives hanging in the balance.
Yeah, it makes it even more crucial to delve into the individual stories we do have, to try and reclaim some of that lost humanity.
Absolutely. Their stories are too often buried under the weight of the larger narrative of colonialism and slavery, but they were individuals just like you and me with their own desires and dreams.
Okay, so we've talked about the ships that brought them here. The Ndongo region, they came from the legal gray areas they existed in and the harsh realities they face. But let's go deeper into some of those individual stories. You mentioned Anthony and Mary Johnson earlier. Their story is incredible.
It really is. Remember, they arrived in Virginia separately in the early 1620s. Both eventually gained their freedom, married, had children, and managed to acquire land. By the 1650s, they owned 250 acres in Northampton County on the eastern shore. And their sons owned land too. The whole family later moved to Maryland, and their grandson even named his farm Angola.
It's almost hard to believe considering the system that was tightening around them. How did they manage to achieve all of that? Were they just incredibly lucky?
Luck likely played a role, but there's more to it than that. Anthony was skilled in animal husbandry and tobacco farming. He was even allowed to testify in court, which was unusual for black individuals at the time. They likely leveraged their skills, built relationships with influential colonists, and capitalized on the opportunities that were still available in those early years. Their story is a testament to their resilience and resourcefulness, but it also raises questions about why others weren't afforded the same opportunities. What made their experience different?
Yeah, it's a reminder that even within a brutal system, there are cracks. And individual stories could defy the larger trends. But as you said earlier, the system was solidifying. What were some of the key developments that led to the more entrenched form of slavery we know?
One major factor was the increasing demand for labor, particularly in the tobacco fields. As the colony grew, so did the need for workers, and unfortunately, enslaved Africans were seen as a readily available and exploitable source of that labor.
It's almost like a feedback loop. More tobacco meant more wealth, which meant more land, which meant more demand for labor. And enslaved Africans were caught in that cycle.
Exactly, and over time, laws were passed that codified their status, stripping them of their rights and cementing their position as property.
So from those ambiguous early years where legal status was less clear-cut, things shifted towards a more rigid and brutal system.
Right. By the mid 1600s, laws had been established that clearly defined enslaved Africans as chattel property, meaning they could be bought, sold, and inherited just like any other possession. Their children inherited their status, making it a generational system of oppression.
It's like watching the walls close and the possibilities for freedom and self-determination shrinking with each passing year.
And that's the tragedy of it all. The stories of those first Africans in Virginia, like Anthony and Mary Johnson, show us that things could have been different. There were moments where alternative paths existed, but ultimately the forces of greed and power steered the colony and the nation down a dark and devastating road.
It's heavy stuff, no doubt about it. But I think it's so important to grapple with these complexities. We can't just brush over the difficult parts of our history.
I completely agree. Understanding this history is crucial if we want to understand the present. It helps us see how the legacies of slavery and racism continue to shape our society today.
You mentioned earlier that the consequences of that early history are still felt today. Can you elaborate on that? How do we see those echoes in the present?
Well, think about the economic disparities that exist along racial lines. Think about the systemic biases in our justice system, our education system, even our healthcare system. These issues are rooted in centuries of inequality that began with the exploitation of those first enslaved Africans.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that the past isn't really past. It lives on in the institutions and systems we've inherited.
Exactly. And it's up to us to confront that legacy, to understand it, and to work towards dismantling the systems of oppression that continue to harm so many.
It's a big task, but it feels more necessary than ever. I'm glad we're having this conversation, even if it's uncomfortable at times. It feels like the more we know, the better equipped we are to make a difference.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, and in this case, it's power that can be used to fight for justice and equality.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the ships that brought those first Africans to Virginia, the Ndongo region. They came from the early laws and legal gray areas, the stories of individual resilience, and the heartbreaking shift towards a more entrenched system of slavery. What are some key takeaways you'd like our listener to hold on to as we move forward in this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember the humanity of those first Africans. They were not just statistics or historical footnotes. They were individuals with families, cultures, dreams, and aspirations. And their stories, however fragmented, deserve to be heard and remembered.
Absolutely. It's about honoring their experiences, both the triumphs and the tragedies, and acknowledging the profound impact they had on the course of American history.
And it's about understanding how their story continues to shape our world today, both the good and the poor. We carry their legacy with us, whether we realize it or not.
It's a sobering thought, but also a powerful one. It feels like we're just scratching the surface here. What else can we learn from those early records and historical accounts? Are there any other story that stand out to you?
There are so many stories waiting to be uncovered, and each one offers a unique perspective on this pivotal period in American history. For example, there's the story of Angela, who was baptized in 1623 and given the surname of her